Hi, I'm Rick, and this is Burn After Reading. In this episode, I'm covering Bob Ruff's shitty and poorly made Forgotten West Memphis 3 two-episode series. I won't be covering his Truth and Justice podcast on the subject because that would take too much time, and there are other things I would rather be doing, such as watch paint dry, get a Brazilian wax, get an unnecessary colonoscopy, go to the wrong airport and miss my flight by less than 5 minutes and have to sit in the airport for 6 hours until the next available flight. Get stuck in standstill traffic for over an hour within 5 minutes of my destination. Anyway, I think you get the picture, and with that said, let's get into it. The two-part series started out with Pam Hicks reflecting on her son Stevie Branch and how much she misses him. The next scene has Bob Ruff sitting across the table from her and asked who she thinks killed her son. Pam responded that she doesn't know. She then begins to cry as Bob Ruff, like some hero at the beginning of a movie, promises Pam he's going to put everything he has into finding out who committed this crime, while cinematic thriller music played in the background. Spoiler alert! It was these guys! Solved in 1994 by 2 juries. Case closed. It's time to go home. But wait, sadly, we're not finished. Then the title of the show appeared, The Forgotten West Memphis 3. Bob goes into how he started helping the potential wrongfully convicted and investigating cold cases. He talked about how he was a fire chief and a fire investigator for around 15 years. In his delusional mind, he figured his skill set as a fire investigator somehow made him qualified to investigate criminal cases. To me, that's like saying because someone was a food health inspector for 10 years made him qualified to inspect fire damage and crimes. But I digress. He goes into how he started true crime podcasting. He rambled on about Ed Ates and took part of the credit along with his supporters and the Innocence Project in helping Ates get parole. You see, it never impresses me when someone maintains their innocence. Charles Manson maintained his innocence. Is that supposed to dazzle me? Still, as of this series, Ed Ates was not exonerated. Nothing has been overturned. He just got parole, and if you go back to my last episode, I gave 2 prime examples of how they do in fact allow murderers to walk free. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying Ed is innocent or guilty. I didn't look into his case, but I am stating the facts as I know them based in law. Now, side note, let's talk about the Innocence Project again. I'm not going to go back into who co-founded it. I discussed that in other episodes, but that stupid organization is supporting Robert Earl Hayes, who was acquitted of murder and rape in Florida of Pamela Albertson back in 1990. And guess what? Turned out after retesting DNA, it was his sperm found inside her vagina, so whoops. Yeah, and the Innocent Project is still trying to get him off another rape and murder charge, so forgive me if I just don't see the honor in that organization. Okay, let's get back on track. Bob then summarized and highlighted the case of the West Memphis 3 to the audience, and Bob, of course, gave a slanted view, acting as if the West Memphis Police Department only focused on Damien, which isn't true. He minimized Damien's mental health issues and conveniently left out some of the truly disturbing things about his, mental health, and you can read the Exhibit 500 at the Callahan site, and you can see for yourself. Bob used the same old tired belief that it was a witch hunt. Never mind that Damien was telling people like Jerry Driver that he was in a cult, so gee golly, wonder how anyone ever got that impression. Again, Bob was framing the narrative in his very independent and clearly unbiased investigation. Bob goes into Jason Baldwin, which he is right that Jason never gave any incriminating statements. If you exclude his confession to Michael Carson, but Damien did in fact tell other people, such as some girls he spoke to before and after the murders, that Jason was in fact with him. And then you got Jesse Miss Kelly's multiple confessions before and after his conviction, which of course leads us to Jesse. Bob goes into his low IQ and how Jesse thought he was going in there for a follow-up based on a statement made weeks earlier. Of course, Bob leaves out that the police didn't see Jesse as a suspect initially, as they were questioning many people and giving polygraph tests. But the thing that alerted law enforcement was that Jesse failed his polygraph. One of the officers said he was lying his ass off. Now, You all know how I feel about polygraph tests, but it can be an effective investigative tool, and I believe in this case that's exactly what happened. Bob's assessment is totally wrong in my opinion. Bob acted as if Jesse didn't know his rights. If you go to part 2 of my series, you'll clearly see without any question Jesse had run-ins with law enforcement due to violent behavior and other things. This idea that he was an easy target is just absolutely absurd. It wasn't absurd to Lee Rush, Jesse's father's girlfriend at the time, when Jesse would wake her up crying after the murders, or when Jesse acted strange to Buddy Lucas and gave his shoes that potentially were worn by him at the crime scene. Now, Lucas got persuaded not to testify during Jesse's trial, but the connections are alarming. Jesse wasn't an easy target. Jesse knew he was caught and did his best to minimize involvement and gave some false information to trip law enforcement up. Jesse explained this to 2 other officers. He again confessed to his lawyer, who made him swear on a Bible, and yet Bob and supporters closed their eyes and ears to this like they're in Netflix's Bird Box. Now, Bob goes on to state that despite a lack of physical evidence linking them to the murders, which is due to everything being cleaned up and submerged in muddy water for nearly 18 to 24 hours before discovery, the West Memphis Three were convicted and scapegoats. I'm not sure if Bob ever commented on the Scott Peterson trial, but should we expect an action series on that one? No real DNA links Scott to Lacey's murder. He was tried and convicted based on circumstantial evidence, based on the totality of the evidence. Is Scott a scapegoat for Bob? I don't know. I'll let him answer that. Now, Bob then goes on about the Paradise Lost series and the celebrity support and the rally cry to free the West Memphis Three. He talked about how some of the family members, namely Pam Hicks and John Mark Byers, believed that they were innocent. Next, Bob goes on about how the West Memphis Three were freed in what I consider to be a deceptive way. He said that the prosecutor had to do something, so after 18 years in prison, the West Memphis Three were offered the Alford plea. No. Let's back up. First of all, it was the West Memphis Three defense who proposed the plea to the prosecutor. It was not the other way around. Now, yes, the prosecutor agreed to it, and the defense confirmed with the West Memphis Three that they would accept all terms despite any reservations from Jason, which I personally feel was posturing to appear like some kind of champion of justice. I didn't buy his bullshit then, and I don't buy it now. It reminds me of something from the John Mark Byers playbook. So Bob goes on to say that if the West Memphis Three didn't kill Michael Moore, Christopher Byers, and Stevie Branch, then who did? He preached heroic as he overlooked past the water and pipe bridge with 1,000-yard stare and proclaimed that he will do the proper investigation, and while he can't bring back the children, he will give them and the families justice. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, Bob Ruff, crime-fighting truth seeker with no fucking credentials as a criminal investigator. He's going to solve the case. The cheese levels are off the charts. So what do we get into in part 1? Well, we get a lot of filler. He goes back to the beginning where it all took place. He goes to the crime scene that has long changed. This means Bob can't really get the same feel that the actual qualified law enforcement investigators had at that time. You know, the ones he thinks he's better than. But that's okay because he's going to do a real and proper investigation. At this point, I'm surprised he's not wearing red and blue spandex with a cape or wearing a Sherlock Holmes outfit. In my opinion, that would really embody his attitude because this dude has a massive ego complex. Instead, we just have to deal with him in his jeans and midlife crisis leather jacket. Now, let's see what Bob uncovers. So Bob Ruff interviews Ryan Clark, the older brother of Christopher Byers. He's shrouded in shadow because he'd rather strangers don't look at him as the man with the murdered brother, which, makes sense. He talked about Christopher as a good kid and talked about his interests. Ryan discussed what was going on in his head the night of the murders, and eventually when, the 3 boys were discovered. Ryan seems pretty receptive to Bob's investigation, going as far as to say if he can figure it out, he'd be in his debt and he would be like a brother. The camera shifts to Bob, who looks like a deer in headlights. Just my opinion. That's what it looked like. It was just expressionless. So Bob explained to the viewers that he hates making family members relive these horrific events by rehashing them, but it must be done to get to the truth. Bob talked to Jolynn Hicks, Stevie Branch's aunt. Jolynn goes into Stevie's character a bit. Bob asked Jolynn how it affected Pam, which, I mean, seems like a stupid question. How the fuck do you think it's going to affect a mother whose child was brutally murdered? But again, who am I to question our beloved superhero Bob? Jolynn stated the obvious that it put a huge hole in Pam's heart, a void that can never be filled. Jolynn goes into law enforcement and how she initially felt they were there for them, and how she tried to respect them, but her opinion shifted. She felt the investigation wasn't done properly. We now go into Pam Hicks, who walked Bob through the day Stevie went missing and eventually discovered. Bob then asked the question we know the answers to because he's a super good investigator. I mean, I wonder if Bob ever randomly asked people, when you're hungry, what do you do? I imagine the look of shock on his face when they answer, eat. Bob then meets Dr. Rebecca Shue, pathologist, to go over the wounds on the children's bodies. He claimed it's to find out what really happened, but it's the same song and dance. Someone is paid to give an interpretation that favors the narrative they want to give. Remember Spitz? Dogs did it. So in this case, it's going back to alligator, turtles, or other aquatic life inflicting the wounds. Again, these can only be interpreted and aren't a matter of fact. Why didn't Bob, let's say, talk to 5 pathologists? If he did, what did they say and is it on record? Maybe Oxygen gave him a certain budget, or maybe they told him who to go to. I mean, who knows? Having said that, there's also interpretation to lead that the wounds were made by a bladed weapon and other blunt objects like sticks or clubs. They match better and make more sense, but shh, can't ruin the narrative. Wrongfully convicted true crime stories create cash. Can't mess with that. Another thing I'd like to add to this is that they limit the conversation of the wounds due to animal inflicted versus satanic ritual, which is quite odd to me. Why isn't the possibility of it being just straight up torture not brought up? We have 3 different people doing 3 different things to these poor little boys. So yeah, I would say that would make the wounds pretty fucking irregular. But if you limit the narratives, it helps lean towards one side against the other. Instead of a thorough investigation, it seems like Super Bob is acting like a defense attorney to create doubt. The only assessment I agree with when it comes to Rebecca Shue is that these kids ultimately died from drowning. Bob then goes on to say that this takes a new turn into the investigation, but he's just piggybacking off the Paradise Lost claims with the exception of Brent Turvey's profile, which I believe he said that the kids were killed elsewhere and then placed in the water ditch sometime after. But everything with the post-mortem wounds coming from animals is the same. Again, a narrative and an interpretation to discredit the wounds inflicted by the killers, as Bob claimed that the real monster is still there and the poor West Memphis 3 have to live their lives as convicted murderers. I mean, pretty objective investigation, right? Bob goes back to 1993 and talked about 2 probation officers who were obsessed with satanic cults. They believed a cult existed in West Memphis and that Damien had involvement. When the children's bodies were discovered, one of the probation officers, who was, I assume at this point is Jerry Driver, said that Damien finally did it. He finally killed someone. Now, Bob acted like these probation officers just pulled this shit out of their ass. What Bob doesn't tell you, as I mentioned earlier, Bob planted those ideas in their head. He talked about being involved in a cult. He told them that the cult was going to advance from animal sacrifice to human sacrifice. But this idea that the West Memphis Police Department had tunnel vision, I believe is absolutely false. They were looking at many people. Bob then talked to former FBI profiler Jim Clemente, or as I like to call him, John Douglas 2.0. You could see him at a CrimeCon event near you. Side note, remember the last episode when I brought up Werner Spitz being sued by Burke, the sister of Joan Benet Ramsey? Guess who else was also sued? That's Jim, the infallible profiler. Eventually, CBS would settle with Burke for a hefty sum. But let's see what Jim and the investigators summarized in that case. The investigators surmised that John Benet made her brother mad. perhaps by stealing a piece of pineapple he was snacking on. Then, in retaliation, Burke hit her in the head with a flashlight. Some members of the team did not think he had an intent to kill, but believed John and Patsy had the intent to mislead and cover up. I think in the end, this was about two parents who deeply cared for their or for the daughter they lost, Clemente said, and wanted to protect the child they had remaining. Utterly stupid. Utterly stupid. But needless to say, of course, everything stated by Jim and crew were pure conjecture. It was really irresponsible, just like when John Douglas profiled and custom fit Paul Guy Morin as a murderer in Canada. You see, people get caught up in these titles, but never really see how they can get it wrong. It's as if the FBI can't ever get anything wrong, but factually they do, and sometimes they do it big time. So Bob walked Jim through the events via an interactive map. From what I gathered, Jim doesn't know anything of this crime, which I find a little hard to believe, but for the sake of argument, let's just go with it. The satanic ritual thing keeps getting brought up, but let's be realistic here. Motive isn't the issue. A motive is not mandatory to prove. It's just the totality of evidence that the accused in fact did it. Think again, Manson family trials and the prosecuting attorney Vincent Bugliosi's helter-skelter theory. Whether it was really Manson's view of the impending race war or Manson scorned over the fact that he wasn't getting a record deal, the fact is he convinced his members to murder people. Criminal profiler Pat Brown believed that the West Memphis Three are guilty of the crimes, but thinks less of the satanic ritual aspect and thinks more of the thrill kill motive. It could even be a mixture of Damien, as, he believed that, drinking blood or tasting blood gave him power, made him feel like a god. That's all well documented. So maybe that did play a part in it, but I think overall it was probably more of a thrill kill. So Dr. Shu and Clemente believed this wasn't ritualistic, which is fine. But there's misdirection here. It doesn't have to be for the West Memphis Three to be guilty, be it ritualistic or a thrill kill. And the limitations can lead to false narratives. So Bob is the pot calling the kettle black. In fact, what Jesse stated in all his confessions is something that was perverse, sadistic, and brutal. That would demonstrate a teenage thrill kill by three intoxicated teens. Remember, Jesse said that they were all drinking. That would explain the three different ways the knots were tied. It would explain the imperfections of how the kids were tied, but they were cautious enough to want to hide and clean up what they did. I mean, at least Jason and Damien. If we were to believe that Jesse left earlier, then okay, there's that, but maybe he did help. But bottom line is, he was there for at least most of what happened. Bob also does a stupid experiment where he puts chicken carcasses in the water. The snapping turtles pick the chickens clean straight to the bone. So, if the turtles cause those injuries on the children, based on his stupid and very unscientific experiment, the same should have been virtually identical to three children. Their flesh should have been picked clean. But that's not what happened. Maybe the next experiment Bob can do is dangle his bare legs in the water and see what happens. Now, I think Bob is going to spin that this experiment was just to see if snapping turtles or whatever other aquatic life showed up, then that could be relevant. But if you really took that shit into a trial, your ass would be laughed out of the courtroom. Anyway, Bob now goes to the Arkansas State University to meet Dr. Lori Newman Lee, who is a herpetologist. Dr. Lori goes over what we already know. Different snapping turtles have claws and can bite. Bob showed Dr. Lori photos of the boy's wounds. She tells Bob what he wants to hear with terms like consistent with or could be, except for the last image. It begs for interpretation, but reveals no actual definitive conclusion or facts. Bob talked about looking at the facts and the evidence without speculation, which makes me think he he doesn't know what facts and evidence means because that's all he's doing during this entire fucking episode. He cherry picks people to get the answers he wants to and moves in that direction that is contradictory to the real facts and evidence. Anyone who has read the case files or watched the series or listened to Lisa O'Brien, Roberta Glass, or William Ramsey and others, they know Bob's super investigation falls flat. It's smoke and mirrors. It's entertainment for Oxygen and his podcast. I mean, I seriously hope his fire investigations went better than this, or else I really feel sorry for the department that he served under. But nevertheless, Super Bob is extremely frustrated, sad, and angry that the case was never solved. But don't worry, it motivates him, and I am sure monetization has no motive whatsoever. Um, so Super Bob will serve justice and make the evildoers pay. Super Bob, or the Dark Ruff, whatever you want to call him, is the hero West Memphis deserves. Next, we move on to part 2. Jim Clemente suggested to Bob that they use some new technology to collect from the existing evidence. So Bob goes to Pure Gold Forensics to meet Susanna Ryan, who specializes in MVAC. Now, Bob kept using the word new technology, but it's important to clarify that MVAC was around if the West Memphis 3 legal team wanted to use it to test or retest DNA while in prison or 3 years after they accepted the Alford plea per the statute. Instead, petitions are being filed 8 years after the statute and in the wrong county, multiple times to boot. Now that we have that understanding, let's move on. Susanna explained the technology to Bob. In narration, Bob explained the limited testing available in 1993, which is true, but still failed to admit the technology was available during later appeals and the post-Alford plea in the 3-year time frame that they had to get new testing done. Bob asked Susanna if older cases, let's say 25 years, would they still be able to pull viable DNA? And Susanna answered that they've gotten great results from cases that were up to 40 years old, which is very impressive. However, she also stated it depended on the evidence at the crime scene. Was it outdoors for weeks or months on end? Was it exposed to extreme heat or water or something like that? She clearly stated those factors can hinder results. Still, Bob needed the right answer or it's the end of the line for the MVAC testing, so he asked, well, what if it was a shoe binding with knots? What then? She said it can, which sounds more like a maybe to me. There's no conclusive answer to whether it actually can. She even admitted again that when it comes to other items like clothes and sticks, that it's less likely to get results. Still, Bob puts all his chips that MVAC is the answer. So Bob, not understanding laws and statutes and jurisdictions, thought that he could just ask Scott Ellington for the evidence and hand it over to Susanna for testing. Bob used some mental gymnastics to put it on Scott Ellington that if new credible evidence was presented that Scott would consider looking at it. Problem is, this isn't new credible evidence. So Bob wanted to open up a dialogue with Scott Ellington to get this done. So for the purpose of good TV, Bob called Scott Ellington's office on his cell and asked for him. And of course, Scott wasn't available. So while he waited to hear back from Ellington, Bob would reach out to Damien, Jason, and Jesse to see if it would be cool and hoped that the district attorney in good faith would just allow Bob to have the evidence retested. So Bob asked Jason first. Jason rambled about even though he's free, he feels lost. Dramatic stuff for the show. Bob the hero told Jason that they're going to keep fighting and that there's this new technology for new testing. And Jason, in an awkward way, said that he was for it. Bob then wanted to cover victimology. This part of the show is filler, but Bob, the hero, wanted to pretend that he's doing a thorough investigation by asking them questions that weren't asked in 1993. I mean, never mind, it's only been 25 years at that time of this shit show of a series, and memories do fade and become selective in time. But I think Bob thinks he's better than law enforcement, so he's going to do it anyway. So Bob talked to Jamie Ballard, who in 2009 wrote an affidavit that she saw Christopher, Stevie, and Michael playing in her backyard the night of the murders from about 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. Bob also discussed the possibility of a fourth boy who may have been with the other 3. So Bob boasts that if he can find this fourth boy, he'd be the first to do that, believing he would have had first-hand account of what the boys were doing and who they came in contact with. So Bob reached out to his Bobo-maniacs, aka his listeners, and asked if they thought there was a fourth boy. One of his followers sent him sent him screenshots of someone named George Taylor, who claimed several years on a Facebook page that he was traveling with Stevie, Michael, and Christopher that day. So Bob called Pam Hicks and asked about George, and she confirmed that she knew him and he was friends with Stevie. So Bob reached out to George and they met. Long story short, it was dead end with lies and fake out revelations. And it's just an utter waste of time and maybe a reason why maybe police didn't follow up on it. But don't worry, everyone. Bob looked into it just to make sure. Again, it was just filler. Bob also talked to Bobby Posey, who told police that Chris came to his house alone that afternoon. Posey in his he's in jail, and Bob had to set up a call with him. Posey told Bob that Christopher Byers came to his house that day and told him that John Mark was hurting him again and was going to run away. Posey suggested Bob talk to Carlos Seals. Bob, with his midlife crisis leather jacket, met with Carlos and he suggested that he may have been the last one to see the boys that day. He claimed, the kids had sleeping bags and backpacks and were going camping. So now the narrative is that the kids weren't just going into the woods, but running away into the woods. Due to Jamie mentioning Ryan Clark in her affidavit, we shift to Bob talking to Ryan again. In that discussion, Ryan gets into how John Mark Byers was as a person and as a stepdad. Ryan never liked him from the beginning, and that he said that John Mark Byers had nothing to do with Christopher, and it drove him nuts to see him on TV, crying about how much he loved and missed him. But in reality, according to Ryan, he hated Christopher. Ryan goes on to dismiss Jamie Ballard's affidavit, giving Inspector Bob the belief that Carlos Seal's testimony to be the correct one. Never mind that perhaps both testimonies are bogus, but Carlos' testimony helped set up the narrative, which leads us back to Jim Clemente to go over the timeline. Now, as Bob goes over the timeline and other parts of his investigation, Jim just takes whatever Bob is saying as fact without actually looking over the case files to check the credibility of it. But lastly, Bob goes into narration, again clownishly comparing fire investigation with murder investigation and how you gotta shift through the ashes to find the truth and who the killer really is. So, this concludes episode 1 of Bob's Shitty Forgotten West Memphis 3 series. There's another episode 2, and next time I will cover that. And I know with this episode I've come off maybe a little bit more aggressive, and I don't want to say the word joking, maybe mocking, and I get that, but I'm sorry, but just when you see this garbage time in and time out, it does upset you. So it's hard to take it seriously, and it would be funny if the situation of it wasn't so serious. So anyways, let's find out what happens on June 23rd. That's where Damien's attorney, who filed in the wrong county, they're going to see if they can get new retesting. So in this crazy world, anything is possible, but I have this sneaky feeling it's not going to go Damien's way, and he's going to play victim. Oh, and then he's got a bunch of other people who are going to be at that courthouse too to, I don't know if protest is the right word, but rally. So, yeah. Anyways, until next time.